Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. As Brian said, this is a project that started a couple years ago. The first iteration of the Startup Sourcebook really took a look at just how to start a biotech, and it was this really great overview of that topic. The second iteration, which I've been fortunate enough to be a part of, takes a deeper dive into several topics that I think become huge hurdles for entrepreneurs who are trying to get into the biotech business, particularly those types of entrepreneurs who are founding scientists. So we're going to look at topics, everything from how to build an IP portfolio, how do you pick people to be on your board of directors, and how do you perfect your partnering pitch, because messaging can be so important when you're building a company and trying to attract partners and investors. So Brian really introduced everyone, so I guess we're going to just jump right in. And I'd love to first go to Teresa. I think one of the biggest challenges when you're starting a biotech, and one of the first things you face when you're starting this challenge, is building your IP portfolio. What are some of the first steps a scientific founder should take when trying to think about how to patent their technology?
So I guess it really depends what type of startup you are. So if you have in-licensed some technology from a university or research organization, then I think really doing your diligence on that portfolio as it exists and understanding how it might cover what you're doing now and in the future. So really doing your personal diligence on that portfolio. If you're acquiring a product or a platform from another company that might be trying to spin that off, then it's the same sort of analysis. Looking at that portfolio that covers it, is that going to adequately protect what you're doing right now and what you envision for at least the next couple of years? How well does it support your strategy for what your company wants to look like over the next few years? And then if you're brand new, just starting from scratch, de novo, you have an idea, you maybe have funding already, and you're going to go out there and do that. I think it's a different approach. Then you really, I think, have a little bit more time to identify, what are we going after? Is it going to be both platforms and products? And then how do we best execute on that? One thing I've had the great luck to work with a number of great startups, although we might have a dispute about what the definition of a startup is. I worked with Loxo Oncology from pretty much when they were formed to their acquisition just a few months ago by Lilly. In 5 years, they got 4 products in the clinic, 1 approved, did a big deal with Bayer, and then the acquisition with Lilly. And we really went into they really thought carefully about their IP strategy. They had in-licensed 1 product and then developed it further from a company in Colorado, but they really looked carefully at what's the existing IP, then what is our product going to be, what is our drug label going to look like, and what do we need to do to fill in any holes, right? So there was very much communication with both the scientists as well as the clinicians to understand how they were moving that product forward, how they were going to get this label, this tumor-agnostic label, and did they have the patents that would cover that method of treatment, right? So a tumor-agnostic label, method of treating cancer with their drugs and then their sort of defensive positions around that. So that it was a lot of communication. The other thing I think that's important, and then I'll stop and let others jump in, is really, as a startup, no matter sort of if you're licensing it from a university or really sort of doing it on your own, have a mindset of due diligence from the beginning, right? So you really want to get everything organized and almost as if you're going to be putting it in a data room from the beginning, because you likely will be for either investment or partnering, and to have that ready to go, to work with your patent attorneys and say, I need to have everything pristine from the beginning. So we need to go into it thinking that I'm going to be in diligence any day now. That means preparing schedules, right, of all your IP from the beginning, understanding the status and updating those, making sure inventorship is clear and clean and that you have that down, making sure your chain of title is really clear, you're getting your assignments done, all of that, because that's really what a partner is really going to be looking at from the beginning. When they're going into diligence, it's going to be, do they own it? Are there inventors out there that are lurking that could cause a problem? And then does it adequately cover what we're trying to get access to if we're partnering here? So, some of the formalities, really pay attention to that from the beginning. And it will, I think, save you a lot of headaches in the end and establish a lot of credibility for your startup if you have that set to go once you enter these partnering talks.
Can I just add something, Lisa?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Romani Varanasi, CEO of Biotics. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'm going to speak slowly and clearly. It's tough to hear you, Lisa, by the way. Okay, so agree with everything that was said. I would just say that from our perspective, we're a company that we didn't have any IP when we started. When I incorporated the company, we essentially accessed a technology that another company has for exclusive use in a particular broad space, antibiotics. And so that was our IP, if you will, sort of the exclusive access to a platform that another company had developed, and we are going to use, we are and were and are going to use that as a discovery platform. For us, the true sort of innovative IP that we've been able to generate is the composition of matter patents, applications that we've filed and will continue to file on the discoveries we've made using the technology. And the one conundrum we face as a smaller biotech compared to a mid-size or even a big pharma is the notion of when to file, how soon to file, because you want to protect your IP at the right time, because from an investor perspective, we're always pitching the story. I'm always on the road telling the story. And you want to be able to say to an investor, I've got novelty and it's protected. But you also don't want to protect it too early, because then the clock starts ticking. And if you're not really able to generate data and exemplary data to add to your filing prior to it being published, then it's sort of for naught at the end of the day. So that's the conundrum that we as a smaller biotech startup company face in the context of novel IP. So discovered or identified and started off with as a company that is in-licensed intellectual property for use in a particular area exclusively. That is our foundation of intellectual property. But beyond that, we have to aggressively prosecute, again, being mindful of the timing, sensitivity of everything.
Chris, maybe you can give some tips on how companies should deal with tech transfer offices when they're in this position.
Well, sometimes I think that the startups are often dealing in a very different space than we are with the tech transfer offices. And feel free to jump in if anyone has more experience on this, and maybe you will, but I know that there's always a challenge there in that the tech transfer offices, it's nice because they will pay for the patents and filing the patents and maintaining them, which can be really cost prohibitive if you try to spin them out early, even if you can license them for cheap. The problem is that universities often will make capricious decisions on what you consider fundamental IP. And in fact, we're talking to someone right now who says, we'd love to talk to you, but we don't have anything because the university decided to drop all our patents because it was a cost-saving move. So they're having to re-strategize around how to build foundational IP around some really amazing technology. So I have the cautionary tale. Now comes the advice. No?
We should have you talk to Elise. I'm going to have Elise talk because you've dealt with.
Well, I think it's the objectives of the tech transfer office and the company are quite different. I mean, I think there's sort of a long-term trajectory for a company. You want to build IP that's really valuable to eventually a partner or an acquirer. And I think sometimes these short-term decisions made by academics can be what's in their best interest, but not in the best interest of that technology or the company. So I think it's really important that you figure out the alignment early and negotiate that. The other challenge can often be making sure that you have exclusive access to that IP, because I think sometimes if it's a platform, there's a desire, again, it makes sense if you're in their shoes to try to license that to multiple different companies, but that can create challenges down the line as well. So always thinking about what's the long-term vision and trying to get them aligned with that is really important.
So one last piece on that, another cautionary tale, is that often we'll find investigators that are spinning out companies and will have foundational IP, but it'll be developed on techniques or items that don't have FTO. So they'll have used an antibody library that actually has a license associated with around commercialization, but is free for academic research. And so we'll go in and start evaluating it. Yes, you've done a good job covering it, but you have all this burden around your knowledge that you've generated. And that's obviously not something that's identified by the academics.
I mean, I think if you can really try to establish the case for the value of what you're doing and what your platform is, or if you're developing new molecules, for example, or new biologics, I think that's important to educate the tech transfer office about that. I think communication there too can be key in terms of them being willing to, spend the money on your cases versus someone else's cases and abandon your cases. So I think trying to explain the ultimate value of what your proposed, how you're going to move that IP forward in the most successful way for them, and so that ultimately in the end they will reap the benefit of that. I think that communication process is really important. I think tech transfer offices have a difficult time now because they have a lot of famous investigators at their institutions who all think that everything they're doing is fantastic. There's a lot of political pressures, and it's hard for them to say, I'm going to spend more money here versus there. It can be a difficult decision. But I think it's worthwhile to you to try to establish that, your IP or your technology that you're licensing from them is important to spend that money on and to develop. And if you end up with a track record of that, then they're going to be more likely to go to you and spend that again in the future.
So I think some of the people that help you make these decisions are your board of directors, but choosing the right people to be part of your board can be a challenging decision. Can anyone give me some idea of what to look for in a board member? Who can be that maybe tiebreaker board member between, say, two scientific founders?
I'll give it a shot. Hi, Dan Gefkin. If you're a venture-backed company, you're going to be pretty limited. Try this one. If you're a venture-backed company, you're going to be pretty limited about your options in regard to the board. You get the CEO, you may get a founder, and the rest will be investors. And with a little bit of luck, you'll get one more. And I think really important for your CEO is that board member is truly a friend of the CEO or a friend of management, not a friend of the board of the investors. And that comes in handy in terms of compensation. It comes in handy in terms of stock compensation. It's really handy in terms of someone to talk to help. And fairly often you're going to get that one independent slot you get. Pretty likely you're going to get forced towards a friend of the investors. And I would push hard to get someone that's in the industry, that understands the world that we all live in, that maybe has been in that shoes before and is likely to be around for the long haul. I have clients that they have investors, angel types, that have never been in this business. They have a right to a board seat because of their investment, but we find out pretty quickly their experience is not helpful. Having a major business person that's been in a large corporation, have someone that has been part of the Federal Reserve Bank and an incredibly astute financial person, knows nothing about the world that we're in. So I think really important with what few options we have to build our board, we focus on people that are going to really help the company, but equally important, will help the CEO and the management team.
So I would just add that for myself or for our company, we our initial board, myself and two of my investors were the board members, and investor board, no independents. And so one of my key goals was to try to fill the two slots we had. We just recently filled one of the independent slots with an independent member. And I can't agree with you more, Dan, when you say, it's sort of that balancing that's required. I will say, though, that since founding the company, I've always been on the lookout, on the search to fill the board with the right board members. And I remember someone who works with Dan, who's my part-time CFO, one of the first pieces of advice this gentleman gave me was, find an independent. And I didn't quite understand it. I said, don't worry, we'll get them. But then once we had the investor board members on the board, I realized how important it was to have an independent. The other thing I'd say is that I very early on undertook a gap analysis, a very sort of proactive, let me put it on an Excel spreadsheet, what do I need, what am I missing, what do I have? And that really helped me formulate the need for a particular phenotype of individual. And the final thing I'd say is I think it's important for any board to have someone who's got operating experience, who has either run a company and knows the ins and outs of what that takes, or has been in a C-level role that's been quite involved in running the company. Because again, as a startup CEO or as someone who runs a company that is in the startup mode, I think that it's very different. What I would need as a CEO to succeed is going to be very different from a Merck CEO. And so I look for people who have been through similar situations that I'm either going through or will go through. And so to be able to turn to someone and say, how'd you handle this particular situation is a really important and critical thing.
And I'll just add, I think, so we're very fortunate to have 3 independent board members, one of whom's here, which has been phenomenal because we have no investors on the board, and it brings a really different perspective to the way we think about strategy. So that's where I think the key is that those independent voices can really think broadly and help you to create a vision that's even broader than what a particular investor may or may not be thinking. The other thing is I just putting in a plug for diversity of types of investors, types of board members, both in terms of gender and multicultural, but also in terms of background. I think we have board members who've had experience at large firm or at small companies. They've been in BD, they've been in finance, so the just diversity of roles that Romani's pointing to is really important because they all, we don't have groupthink. Everyone comes with a different perspective on how to think about the next steps.
Yeah, so we work with about 160 companies right now, many of which are looking for board members. And in the push towards diversity, everybody has ideas, and as you work to find that diversity, be careful how you position it. A lot of, maybe odd as a male saying this, but I can think of a lot of very capable female potential board members who bristle at the concept of being asked to the party because they could be a good female board member. Not interested. They want to be a good board member. And I think that's no matter whatever your diversity you're trying to solve. People really bristle at sort of I'm only here because.
So can I take this question and pivot it? Is that okay in a startup thing? A topic came up about getting good advice from people that have been there and done that. And I'm not on a startup, but I work with 2 California trade associations. And one of the things that we hear the best feedback from, besides some of the mentorship programs we do, is putting together CEO dinners and just somehow connecting people that are at similar stages and giving them an unofficial format in which to communicate with each other. Maybe those that are doing this can speak to the quality of this and how you find access to these types of events.
Is this working? Yeah. So I'm involved. I'm in the Boston area. I'm involved in a couple of CEO groups, and they're not official dinners as such, but they're, I guess, unofficial meeting groups where CEOs or CEO roundtables, whatever you want to call them, get together once a month. Over 2-3 hours, commiserate, talk about what's going well, what's not going well, who's got the most money, when is anyone's cash run out date, who wins, who doesn't.
You don't mean the most money at the table, you mean the most money to go find money.
No, the most money to survive as a company.
Oh, do they have to buy the meal? Is that how it works?
No, we just laugh at them or something. So there are opportunities and forums like that, and I think one of the things that I learned really early is to go seek them. And you just talk to people like, you're a CEO, I'm a CEO, let's talk. And how do we figure out how to help each other? Because we're frankly all facing very similar problems, maybe in slightly tangential areas, diagnostics versus medtech versus therapeutics. But essentially, from an operating perspective, an operating role, they're essentially the same challenges. So I agree. I don't know that Mass Bio necessarily, which is the trade organization in Boston, necessarily has a formal group that they organize, but I've been spending a lot of time talking to them about how do we make this type of forum available or accessible to CEOs through that trade organization. So I think it's a great concept, and I know that there are informal groups like that in the Boston area.
I think that's actually a really great segue into one of the other topics we talked about, which is being in a sort of biotech cluster, hot geography for biotechs. Is it important to be there so you can have these kinds of meetings, have these impromptu meets with people in the street or at coffee shops? Is it necessary for biotechs to be in these spaces, and how do you help facilitate companies to come to those spaces?
So I'm going to give a really quick answer to the question, is it good to be in that area? Yes. I mean, there's, I think, no other way around it. So from a micro perspective, so I've been in the Boston area for 25 some odd years. I was at Millennium, which was pre-Takeda, many, many years ago. Spent a decade there. Then I went around a handful of smaller biotechs in the Boston area, all in the Kendall Square area, by the way. And for those of you who know Boston today versus 20, 25 years ago, it's changed a lot. My company is not in Kendall Square. It's not even in Cambridge. I'm actually happy about that. We don't have accelerator space. We don't need accelerator space because we're virtual. We also don't pay the exorbitant rental rates, lease rates that companies in the Cambridge area do. So I think the macro environment of Boston or any of the hubs on the West Coast, East Coast, or even North Carolina area, I think it's great to be there, and to the extent you can set up a small satellite office to connect with the local network, I think that's great as well. But in terms of the microsphere of having to be in Kendall Square, I've got a particular view, which is you don't need to be there. Save your money, spend it on R&D, spend it on other things that are going to help you as a company advance, as long as you have an ability to reach into the people you need to reach into. That's my personal opinion. And I know many people might disagree on that. But again, we've been able to put our money to good use and not have it go to just paying the lease fees.
So my first job in this industry was in 1993 in Providence, Rhode Island. And Mark Levin, who founded Millennium and Third Rock Ventures, he set it up there because we got a $1.8 million grant from the state of Rhode Island. And it's hard to imagine it was a good decision. We had a horrendous time recruiting. Providence is 60 miles from Boston, but a really tough environment. I recently consulted with a company out of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And when it came time to invest, many investors felt they could never find the talent necessary to build a company there. So I spent a long time working with a company called Apellis. Recently went public. It's got a $1 billion market cap. It was in Louisville, Kentucky. Might be one of 3 biotech companies in Kentucky. I think today they have 10 employees in Louisville and 100 in Waltham, Massachusetts. So if you need to be in a place, it is mostly because of the science, because of academia. But what I think people find for survival, that very core disciplines end up in a cluster. And there are things like ClinOps, regulatory, business development, et cetera. And so I think you can kind of bridge it. But if you don't end up in a core, it's just very hard for me to find how you're going to find the people to build your company.
So Dan, I'm going to paraphrase. I think it was Gail Medeiros that says nobody at the launch of their drug, the CEO never gets up and says, "I want to thank the economic development grant that helped us launch this drug." That's nobody ever said that, right? So while it's true that those are very enticing and can be useful, it is about getting the talent you need for your company. We run an incubator in San Francisco where our innovation center is, called the Collaborator. It's currently about 35,000 square feet, has 10 companies. It's across the street from the Helen Diller Cancer Center at UCSF. What we hear from most of the tenants we have in that space is that they're there because of the proximity to the hospital. And their collaborators are there, the samples are there, a lot of their board members are there. That being said, one of the companies in that space has set up a data science group in Paris because it was actually cheaper to set up a small group and hire data scientists in Europe than it was to do it in Mission Bay in California. So it's about being smart with where you find the talent, but also recognizing that, especially at the early days, you have to make sure that you can get access to that talent.
I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think, I would just argue you don't have to be in Boston or in San Francisco to be in biotech. And I think sometimes those are the hubs where everyone points to. I need to move to Boston. I need to move to San Francisco. I think it's about talent, but I think it's also sometimes being a small fish in a big pond is not as advantageous as being a bigger fish in a smaller pond. And what I mean by that is areas like North Carolina have a research triangle park that's growing, lots of great talent coming out of universities. Depending on where you're from, you don't have to necessarily pick up and move to the hubs. I think you can be thoughtful about where that balance of talent, investors, and opportunity lies. So just would throw that out.
Maybe some of our panelists here, certainly our CEOs, can talk about messaging when you're looking for these board members, when you're looking for these investors. How do you sort of perfect your partnering pitch? And I think we'd also love to hear from Chris on what does the other side think, when you're sitting on the other side of the table.
Okay, I'll start. We want to see the data. We want to see what differentiates you from your competitors, and we want to see a strong team, and that includes your board and your advisors. In general, we heard the cautionary tale about sharing proprietary data before you have the rights to patent it, but it doesn't mean you can't show the effect that your products have and what they look like, just like a scientific paper would, because that's how we're going to evaluate, especially the earlier projects. I mean, as we get later, like the Loxo deal, we're looking at commercialization because the scientific risk is gone. It's about how you actually find the patients for a really targeted cancer therapeutic. But in the early stages, there's still scientists talking about it, and we don't want to see, the projected revenue, the size of the market for cancer. We kind of, that's sort of where we work in, but we want to talk about the science.
So I agree with that, and I'll add a tiny counterpoint. And the counterpoint here is that, so how do you pitch? It's about telling a story, refining the story, telling it again, refining it again, obtaining feedback, refining it again, telling it again, etc. And the data supports that story, but so do other aspects. So, for instance, we are an antibiotics company. We work on trying to address multi-drug resistant gram-negative pathogens. It's an area that's not necessarily well-funded. It's underfunded, in my opinion. It's a little pitch for the funders out there. And
do you get sick of people bragging about the fact they found cures?
Well, yeah. Well, so the only counterpoint I was going to offer there is that our story has to involve the commercial rationale up front. Because if it doesn't, if all we talk about is the science and the people and the data, in this particular field, it's really important to be able to say why, how are you going to make a difference? How is reimbursement going to change? Is it going to change? What are you doing, discovery company, preclinical company, to effectuate that change? And first I scratched my head saying, well, it'll fix itself. The market will fix itself. But then I got involved. I learned about policy. I'm talking to policymakers. I spent time last week with lobbyists trying to, figure out how can we participate in their pitch on the Hill, getting in front of the staffers on at the Senate, at the House. And so little did I realize that my story was going to have to evolve to include the holistic picture of what it's going to take to discover, develop, and ultimately successfully market a drug. And so I've learned over the past 2.5 years to further refine the story. Now, that said, if I don't have the best science and data to support that science, and if I don't have the best team, then again, it's not going to be worth the effort. So for me, it's the pitch has always been about the story, which is a really, I'm probably saying things that it's everyone knows, but for me, it was a little bit of a aha moment when I realized that I had to up front talk about what the market is And why is it important that we address it? Well, it's a global unmet need. And then from there, you sort of say, well, what's the true unmet need? And how are you going to fill the need? And then let's tell you how we're going to fill the need. So it has evolved as a story unto itself. And what supports us in a good or bad way is that, I think NPR in Boston on Sunday afternoon, all things considered, had a big clip on vaccines. I think Seth Berkley from IAVI was up there or talking. And then there's all sorts of news and publications being put out there about gram-negative antibiotics, superbugs, resistance, etc. So that supports the story, and it supports the pitch that I, as a company, have to make. And so it's about the science and the people. But for us, it's frankly always been about the commercial rationale up front.
I just wanted, I think I was speaking very specifically if you're pitching to a pharma company. Right, and that's because if you're pitching to us, we probably are well aware, have done modeling on the commercial applications, especially as more non-traditional money is getting into the sector. I think telling the story and educating them on the path towards value is probably more important.
And I'd just say it all comes back to the patient. So I'm a practicing physician as well, and I think I often see other companies with really interesting ideas, but they haven't talked to clinicians yet. So you might have a great drug, and you might actually be able to sell it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make a huge impact and be able to really change the landscape of medicine. And I have to say, medicine and clinical care is shifting dramatically. Pricing, reimbursements, we face that with, if we have to write a prior authorization form to get a drug, it doesn't happen, right? And so knowing those ins and outs of how that drug is ultimately going to be distributed to patients, and then ultimately what patients think about the treatments that they're on, is really important. So even if you're really early, I think going to talk to clinicians and patients and understanding where your product will fit within the landscape, not only from a commercial standpoint, but understanding what's missing. Is it a safety issue? Is it an efficacy issue? Is it a pricing issue? Where can you, with your technology, play a role in differentiating and not forgetting, I think, why we all come to work every day.
And how early in your life cycle as a company do you feel you have to start thinking about this messaging? I know, Ramani, you mentioned as early as maybe preclinical, you're starting to think of this. You're certainly not thinking about partnering with pharmas at that point. So, how do you think about that and develop that?
Yeah, so for us, it was at the time of incorporating the company because we knew that we were going to incorporate. We were in this space, and we needed to have the right pitch. And so we've refined it over time. And to Lisa's point, the patients are the most important. And so, what is that unmet clinical need? Are the current antibiotics serving the notion of emerging resistance? No. Okay, so we're going to try to address resistance. And what are the pathogens that are not being appropriately treated? Okay, great. We're going to target those if we possibly can. So it started, frankly, for us from day one. That said, the pitch was much more scientifically oriented. Look at this cool technology, and there's been a lack of discovery in the antibiotics field for 30 to 40 years, no novel classes. We're going to identify novel classes. It was very much a scientifically driven pitch. But very early on, the feedback from the investors was our pivot, if you will, on the messaging was driven by investor feedback. And investors are important to us because they fund us. And so we have to listen to what they say. And so for us, it's been an evolution. But it started, frankly, from the day we incorporated.
So early in my life in biotech, I asked one of my peers, if they were raising money. And he told me, in this world, you're either raising money, you're getting ready to raise money, or you just raise money. And so I think that means you're always working on this, and you're always iterating and thinking about the next message point you're going to make, and whether that's to potential partners or investors. I work with a lot of CEOs who do this. It's always been amazing to me how most CEOs think they're absolutely fabulous in PowerPoint, and they're not so much. I think it's really important to get it right, to find help, and as you're iterating, get people outside the company, get fresh faces to look at it, and to make sure that your message is coming across right. And if it doesn't look good, you can argue whether or not it's important if it looks good. I think it is. I'd get an expert in PowerPoint and make sure it looks good, and find some friends who are outside that are helping you iterate it and keep it fresh constantly. You don't want to get a call from an investor who wants to come out and see you and you don't have a deck ready that's current. So you're always working on it and always iterating.
Yeah, I'll just add to the point of external input. For a non-confidential deck, I thought it's easy. I mean, I've pulled decks together before, 20-some-odd years of corporate development. That's what I've done. But to prepare a non-con deck, I actually ended up getting an IR person to help me with it because I thought the message was clear. And when this person read the deck, he said, "I'm not getting the point, Romani." And so I was shocked and maybe insulted or whatever. But it was it was really helpful. And then we went on a whiteboard, spent 2 hours unraveling the presentation, and most importantly, his key take home for me was, what are the 4 or 5 key takeaways you want your audience to know? Every slide, or not every slide, but the presentation, but from the time you start to the time you get to the end of a 10-slide non-con deck, you should be able to have them walk away checking the box for all those key messages. And so, again, you think it's all in your head and you're like, I got it straight on paper, I got it right on the PowerPoint, but once you've drunk your Kool-Aid enough times, it's probably best to just hand the material off to someone else. And so we've, over the past several months, continued to refine the story, and part of that has been accessing external input to do that, and it's been invaluable.
And work with your partners. So we've had the privilege of working with Fish, and get your attorneys and others to weigh in on the slides that are representing that part of things, because they've seen a lot of companies and they know how to present that part of the deck in the right way. So, we've certainly taken a collaborative approach to how we do our presentations and really incorporate all aspects, not just of the internal team, but all these collaborators who've been helpful along the way.
Being here at BIO, it's so important to get that sort of 30-second pitch messaging down. I'd love for all of you to give a tip on how you approach meetings like this and giving your pitch in that cocktail-like setting.
I think it comes back to what is the 1 or 2 key takeaways you want that person to walk away with. If you've never met them before, you have to get them to remember the company name, you, and the messaging about what you do in 30 seconds. So don't try to say too much. I think limit it to what is the one takeaway that you want remembered. And they like to say, when you do presentations, tell someone what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you just said. And I think that can be true in a 30-second pitch to kind of really make sure that the key point is highlighted.
I think we're winding down. So if there are any questions from the audience, anyone? If not, I think we'll thank our panelists for this awesome discussion. We appreciate all of your insights. Thanks to the Bioprocess Theater for having us here.